Welcome on Easy Learning. Now today I am going to start a new chapter. It is The Scientific Point of View by J.B.S. Haldane. In this part of the video, as usual, I will read the whole chapter, and in other parts of the videos, at first I will explain in one part of the video about author J.B.S. Haldane, and the rest parts of the videos I will explain through the paragraph system, as usual, as I have already explained in other chapters in other videos. So you can enjoy them. So without wasting the time, now I am going to start it. The Scientific Point of View by J.B.S. Haldane. John Burdon Sanderson Haldane, born in 1892 and died in 1964, was a versatile genius. He studied Greek and Latin at Oxford and then went to London to do research in zoology. He was interested in a variety of subjects and at different times held such posts as reader in biochemistry in Cambridge, professor of genetics in London University, professor of physiology at the Royal Institute and professor of statistics at the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. In an autobiographical sketch, he once said that he knew 11 languages. Haldane was a Marxist and used to contribute articles to the Marxist Daily Worker on scientific topics, written in a style which even a person with average education could understand. His works include Daedalus or Science and the Future, Possible Worlds, Science and Ethics, and the Inequality of Man, from which the present essay is taken. In this essay, Haldane explains why it is important for mankind to adopt the scientific standpoints. He writes in an informative and thought-provoking style. The Scientific Point of View. Science affects the average man and woman in two ways already. He or she benefits by its applications, driving in a motor car or omnibus instead of a horse-drawn vehicle, being treated for disease by a doctor or surgeon rather than a witch, and being killed with an automatic pistol or a shell in place of a dagger or a battle axe. It also affects his or her opinions. Almost everyone believes that the earth is round and the heavens nearly empty instead of solid. And we are beginning to believe in our animal ancestry and the possibility of vast improvements in human nature by biological methods. But science can do something far bigger for the human mind than the substitution of one set of beliefs for another, or the inculcation of skepticism regarding accepted opinions. It can gradually spread among humanity as a whole the point of view that prevails among research workers, and has enabled a few thousand men and a few dozen women to create the science on which modern civilization rests. For if we are to control our own and one another's actions, as we are learning to control nature, the scientific point of view must come out of the laboratory and be applied to the events of daily life. It is foolish to think that the outlook which has already revolutionized industry, agriculture, war and medicine will prove useless when applied to the family, the nation, or the human race. Unfortunately, the growing realization of this fact is opening the door to innumerable false prophets who are advertising their own pet theories in sociology as scientific. Science is continually telling us through their mouths that we are doomed unless we give up smoking, adopt or abolish birth control, and so forth. Now it is not my object to support any scientific theory, but merely the scientific standpoint. What are the characteristics of that standpoint? In the first place, it attempts to be truthful and therefore impartial, and it carries impartiality a great deal further than does the legal point of view. A good judge will try to be impartial between Mr. John Smith and Mr. Chang Sing. A good scientist will be impartial between Mr. Smith, a tapeworm, and the solar system. He will leave behind him his natural repulsion of the tapeworm, which would lead him to throw it away instead of studying it as carefully as a statue or a symphony, and his awe for the solar system, which led his predecessors either to worship its constituents or at least to regard them as inescutable servants of the Almighty, too exalted for human comprehension. Such an attitude leads the scientist to a curious mixture of pride and humility. The solar system turns out to be a group of bodies rather small in comparison with many of their neighbors, and executing their movements according to simple and easily intelligible laws. But he himself is a rather aberrant member of the same order as the monkeys, while his mind is at the mercy of a number of chemical processes in his body which he can understand but little and control hardly at all. Insofar as it places all phenomenon on the same emotional level, the scientific point of view may be called the God's eye view, but it differs profoundly from that which religions have attributed to the Almighty in being ethically neutral. Science cannot determine what is right and wrong, and should not try to. It can work out the consequences of various actions, but it cannot pass judgment on them. The bacteriologist can merely point out that pollution of public water supply is likely to cause as many deaths as letting off a bomb in the public street, but he is no better equipped than anyone else in possession of the knowledge he has gained. For determining whether these two acts are equally wrong, the enemies of science alternately abuse its exponents for being deaf to moral considerations and for interfering in ethical problems which do not concern them. Both of these criticisms cannot be right. Now the tendency of the average man has always been to dwell on the emotional and ethical side of the case rather than on facts of the somewhat dull kind which interest the scientist. Let me take two examples, the problem of the American Negro and the problem of disease. A large number of Americans hold that the Negro is definitely inferior to the white man and should as far as possible be segregated from him. Others believe that he should enjoy the same rights. The biologist cannot decide between them. He can point out that the Negro's skull is more ape-like than the white's, but his hairless skin less so, and so forth. But he cannot note the results of the two divergent political views as to the Negro. In the country districts of the southern states, the birth rate of the Negro population exceeds the death rate. In the southern towns and all through the north, more Negroes die than are born. Their high death rates are due to the fact that in an environment suitable to a white man, they die of consumption and other diseases, just as the white man dies on the west coast of Africa, the Negro's original home. So if you keep the Negro out of cars, factories, and so forth, or frighten him away from contact with whites by an occasional lynching, you drive him back to the cotton fields, where he lives healthily and breeds rapidly, thus creating a Negro problem for future generations. But if you extend the hand of friendship to him, you also infect him with your maladies, besides establishing in your midst a reservoir of disease germs. These results are quite typical of those obtained when our action is guided either by raw emotion of the political dogma rather than scientific thought. The main biological effect of the American Civil War was to raise the Negroes' death rate and lower their birth rate so enormously that it was only between 1910 and 1920 that the number of Negroes in the United States increased as much as it had done in the decade before the Civil War. The number of Negroes thus killed was the greater than the casualty list of the Civil War. If tomorrow the colored population of the southern states, but not the white, were given free access to cheap whiskey and methods of birth control, the number of Negroes would probably begin to fall off. I believe that there are many other political questions, both national and international, whose sting would be removed by a similar consideration of biological facts. Our approach to the problem of disease is even less rational. I am not thinking of Christian scientists or spiritual healers, but of the average man or woman who has a certain belief in the results of modern medicine and even of a part of the medical profession itself. Serious illness in ourselves or our friends always rouses a good deal of emotion. Now, when we are emotional about a subject, we feel a need to believe something about it, and we do not care very much whether our beliefs are rational. The pre-Christian attitude to disease was that it was a punishment from some deity for a sin either of the sick person, his family, or the whole community. Jesus did not take this view. When asked concerning a man born blind, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? He replied, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. This is not so unlike the attitude of the scientist who regards a case of disease as a manifestation of a natural law which can only be cured or prevented when research has revealed the working of the law in question. But many religious people still hold to the views which Jesus combated, and those who believe themselves to be more enlightened are often in no better case. Many believe that diseases could be prevented by a return to nature. I suppose that the first step in a return to nature would be the discarding of clothes, which would at once increase the mortality from pneumonia about 100-fold. Of course, the phrase live according to nature is quite meaningless. Civilized and savage man, health and sickness are equally parts of nature. Some features of civilization are bad for health, but for all that, such statistics as are available show that civilized men live longer than uncivilized. The greatest causes of this have been the evolution of waterborne diseases such as cholera and the general prosperity which has nearly vanished under feeding as a cause of ill health. Today, medical science is still advancing, but it is becoming harder and harder to apply its result in practice. The worst sufferers from diabetes can regain full health and keep it indefinitely by 2 or 3 daily injections, but they cannot be got to realize this fact because they have never been taught that their bodies are systems obeying quite indefinite laws, and diabetic will no more work within insulin than a motor car without lubricating oil. A medical friend recently had to deal with 2 women brought in dying of diabetes to the hospital where he worked. Both had been treated before and taught to inject themselves twice daily with insulin, but one had broken her syringe and had no trouble to replace it at once, while the other had neglected her injections for 2 days because she was coming to hospital in any case for another complaint. Attitudes like this are as common that the discovery of insulin has made no appreciable difference to the mortality in England from diabetes. It has saved a few intelligent people, but that is all. If a definite cure for cancer is discovered in the next few years, it is unlikely that it will be a simpler or safer affair than that of diabetes. If so, it will not have much effect on the mortality for several generations. In such a case, any given person can no doubt flatter himself on belonging to the intelligent minority who will be saved. But if what science arrives at is not a cure, but a means of prevention, the case is even less hopeful. Experience has shown that, in this respect, individual action is almost useless. In a country where typhoid fever is common, It is hard always to drink beer or wine, or personally to say that one's water is boiled, and annual inoculation involves a day's mild illness. Typhoid infection can only be dealt with adequately by public control of the water supply, which involves no effort by individual citizens. Diphtheria, smallpox, measles, and other airborne diseases could be stamped out by public effort, but such an effort would involve the individual assistance and self-sacrifice of sick persons and their relatives, and also international cooperation. It is impossible until people realize that microbes are every bit as real as foreigners, and much more likely to kill one. They will only arrive at sane view regarding disease as a result of general education on scientific lines. The study of medicine, apart from its scientific basis, creates neurotics rather than scientists. Preventive medicine could be made into the moral equivalent of war. It is already so far a few people. A colleague of mine was recently translating a French paper on chemotherapy when he came upon the phrase "tout par eye anime" in reference to a deceased pharmacologist. I suppose he said that means that he died of an accidental infection. I undeceived him. The enemy in this case had been the German nation, but his attitude was typical of medical scientists today. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. St. Paul thought that the world was largely ruled by demons. We know better today, and we demand the general adoption of the scientific point of view, because in its absence, human efforts is so largely devoted to conflicts with fellow men, in which one, if not both, of the disputants must inevitably suffer. It is only in times of disaster that the average man devotes a moment's thought to his real enemies, the rulers of the darkness of this world, from bacteria to cyclones. Until humanity adopts the scientific point of view, those enemies will not be conquered.